Welcome to the Still Curtain podcast. It's Monday, January 6th, and the Pittsburgh Steelers are 10-6. They finished the regular season 10-6. Stop me if you've heard that one before. After a 19-17 loss to the Cincinnati Bengals at Acrisure Stadium on Saturday night. I'm Josh Yourish, and today we're going to take a first look at the Steelers-Ravens wildcard matchup in Baltimore on Saturday. But first, we'll decide who to blame for this offensive collapse and where the Steelers go from here. Not doing an instant reaction pod this week, of course, as you can tell now if you're here on a Monday afternoon. I was at the game on Saturday night. I actually had some optimism going into the game on Saturday night. I felt that the Steelers could beat the Bengals with their much maligned defense that's been a huge problem all year, and maybe find some formula for success in the cold weather against Joe Burrow and that high-powered passing attack. The latter absolutely happened. The former, not at all. The Bengals completely shut the Steelers down in a really frustrating and incredibly cold Saturday night down at Acrisure Stadium. And this is a story that we've seen before. This is what the Steelers are under Mike Tomlin, post Ben Roethlisberger. And we need to figure out whose fault it is to understand where the Steelers can go to get out of this purgatory. Because the Steelers didn't just go into Saturday with a chance to win the game and put themselves in a first-round matchup at Houston, which would be a much more favorable matchup against the 10-7 Texans. And 10-7 rather, not 10-6 for the Steelers. But they also had an opportunity in the final 4 games of the season, which they lost all 4, to prove themselves as a legitimate AFC contender. There was an opportunity laid out in front of the Steelers with Baltimore, with Kansas City, with Philadelphia, and with Cincinnati to win 1, maybe 2 of those games. And even though the Bengals aren't in the playoffs, say we beat a pretty good team in this stretch when these teams needed these games, we could make some noise in the playoffs. And the Steelers didn't do that. They squandered that opportunity with putrid offensive performances, one after the other. The offense has completely fallen apart with Russell Wilson at quarterback and with Arthur Smith calling the plays and with plenty of other things, with George Pickens injured and then with George Pickens back in. He had his worst performance of the season on Saturday with Najee Harris at running back, with Jaylen Warren at running back. Every which way you slice it, this offense has failed down the stretch against good defenses. And so I'm going to make both arguments because it seems that it really comes down to you either think Arthur Smith is to blame, as is always the case when there's a failing offense and questions at quarterback. You either blame the coordinator or you blame the quarterback. So let's make the argument for both. I'll make the pro Arthur Smith, anti Russell Wilson argument first. And then I'll make the pro Arthur Smith, anti Russell Wilson argument second. And then I'll tell you where I actually kind of land, because I can see it both ways. This is not just a debate class exercise. I can really see both ways and both arguments and understand the validity to each of them. So this exercise both helps me figure out where I land, and then I have a bit of a wild card at the end that might be the real explanation. But let's start with argument 1. Blaming Russell Wilson. There's a pretty compelling case. Arthur Smith isn't perfect as a play caller, but the issues of this offense look and smell a lot like the issues of Russell Wilson offenses past. At Denver, in Seattle, Russell Wilson cannot throw over the middle of the field. Russell Wilson struggles with play action. We knew those two things coming into the year. That's why it was a nightmare matchup or meshing between he and Arthur Smith. Wilson is a highly volatile player because he relies so heavily for his production on deep balls, which are just a high variance play by nature, regardless of the talent of the quarterback and wide receiver group, and takes a lot of sacks because he is a scrambler at heart. He wants to create plays. He wants to run around in the backfield. So that leads to a lot of big plays, a lot of explosives, and a lot of negatives. That can make you highly volatile because if the big plays dry up and the sacks are there, your offense completely sputters. And that happened. That's not a new thing for Russell Wilson. That has happened in Seattle, as I mentioned, when he was good. When Russell Wilson was an all-pro caliber quarterback and on the fringe of MVP discussions, that offense had 4-week stretches like this offense has had because of that volatility. That's just inherent with a quarterback like Russell Wilson. It's why he's never won an MVP. It's why even at his best, he was never allowed to cook, as the let Russ cook arguments went. Right? Pete Carroll and the offensive infrastructure in Seattle knew that they had a limited player, knew that they needed to protect him with a really effective running game. And that took the form of Marshawn Lynch early in his career, and then Chris Carson and a variety of other backs that were very successful on very high volume in Seattle. That is a bug of the Russell Wilson offense and something you need to surround him with. Those dry spells have always been the case. And as it's gotten worse with this offense, he's leaned more and more into the bad habits, into those scrambles, into one read and bail out of the pocket. Russell Wilson in his past has complained about poor offensive line play, and that's certainly the case in Pittsburgh. Broderick Jones has been a roller coaster on the right side, though he's been better as of late. And Dan Moore Jr. started the year really strong at left tackle, but he was never going to be your long-term answer, and that's shown in the second half when he struggled more and more. The interior's been riddled with injuries. Zach Frazier's been like the one constant, and he's missed time. But always with Russell Wilson, protection has been a problem because sacks largely are a quarterback stat, especially under pressure. Quarterbacks resort to either becoming a check down Charlie. We've seen some of that from Russ. We certainly saw that from Justin Fields early in the season. They can become very turnover prone, trying to force throws into tight windows. Haven't seen a lot of that from Russ. His bugaboo, if you will, under pressure is that he holds onto it, tries to create big plays, and he takes a lot of sacks because of it. That's a play style thing. You don't grow out of that unless you're Joe Burrow. He's one of the few that's been an exception probably to prove that role. Largely how Josh Allen has been able to develop into a highly accurate passer after he came out of Wyoming with big question marks. That's not something every quarterback can do. There are play style limitations with Russell Wilson. There are athleticism limitations with Russell Wilson now and later into his career. And there have always been body type limitations. He can't see over the middle of the field. And now he's leaning into those bad habits even worse. And they're even more glaring when you're a scrambler and you're in your mid to late 30s because you lose a half a step. And that's all it takes for defensive ends and even defensive tackles and linebackers to chase you down. Just look at the very last drive. It's all of Russell Wilson's worst habits. Sacks and scrambles. The drive began just under the 2-minute warning at the 24-yard line with one timeout. A 13-year veteran Super Bowl winning quarterback should be able to get you a field goal. You're down 2 that wins the game. That sends you to Houston as the 5 seed. You didn't win the division, but you got a really good chance to win that game. He starts it off, a short pass inbounds to Najee Harris behind the line of scrimmage, -2 yards. Now, then another short pass inbounds to Freiermuth, who tried to get out of bounds, but was tackled in play. At least that one was heading towards the sideline for 3 yards. So they've gained 1 yard on those first 2 plays and lost 50 seconds. Now you're looking at a minute with 1 timeout from the 25-yard line. Luckily, Wilson connected on a 17-yard pass to Freiermuth. Move the sticks. All right. Now you found some momentum. Clock's running down. Then a scramble for 3 yards, a sack for -5 yards, -2 yards on those two plays. They snapped the play after the Freiermuth completion for 17 yards, which was the now infamous scramble by Russell Wilson, which he was tackled inbounds and never really had a shot to get out of bounds. Should have absolutely just thrown the ball away. It was a baffling decision. Troy Aikman, I've rewatched the TV broadcast mostly to hear Troy Aikman's thoughts on that play and many of the other Russell Wilson plays, and he was flabbergasted by that decision, as was everyone in the stadium. He gained 3 yards, wasted 23 seconds. That play was snapped with 48 seconds left. And the sack play, the next play, was snapped with 25 seconds left. So on those two plays, they lost 2 yards, gaining 3, losing 5, and wasted nearly the entire clock from 48 seconds to 20 seconds when they called the timeout. 3rd and long, incomplete to Pickens, not on the same page with his best receiver, which has been the story over the past 2 weeks, and a story that those two have talked about, both separately in different locker room scrums. When Pickens was questioning a reporter last week if Russell Wilson said they weren't on the same page because he didn't really feel that way. So they weren't even on the same page about being on the same page. And then incomplete to Freiermuth, probably a drop, pretty good throw, game, season. Almost certainly season. The Steelers still have a chance to beat Baltimore. They've beaten Lamar before, but it doesn't feel good heading into that matchup, and it doesn't feel good because of Russell Wilson's play. Wilson's high sack rate makes it so hard for this offense to function on schedule. And he's so jumpy in the pocket when he can't get the ball to his first read. He torched a few awful defenses early, but defenses adjusted to this offense with him at quarterback. They adjusted to the quick stuff off play action. There was only one play action pass called yesterday for Russell Wilson. And in my opinion, that's not an Arthur Smith active game plan decision. That is a limitation of Russell Wilson as a quarterback. Arthur Smith would love to run nearly 30-40% play action. That's what he's always done throughout his career. He's had to adjust to the strengths and weaknesses of his quarterback, and the weaknesses are outweighing the strengths at this point. Once the deep ball dried up, Smith and Wilson had no counter. He's a scrambler at heart. That'll never change. Arthur Smith's offense was best with Ryan Tannehill in Tennessee. He was a mobile guy. He could scramble effectively, but he was the ultimate stand in the pocket, take a shot, and deliver the ball over the middle quarterback. That's why he was so good. To even cater to Wilson's strengths, Smith has been forced to greatly alter his ideal offensive attack. And that's one reason that you could blame, or plenty of reasons, but that's one reason you could blame Russell Wilson for the offensive collapse of the Pittsburgh Steelers. You know who else you could blame? You could blame Arthur Smith. I'll make the other argument now. Because even that ideal attack that Arthur Smith had to greatly alter to cater to the needs of his quarterback now in Pittsburgh has been largely solved by the rest of the NFL. As I mentioned, Najee Harris almost exclusively zone runs yesterday. Very few gap scheme runs, power runs. The in vogue offense was the Shanahan-McVay stuff for years, from 2017, 18, 19 to 22, 23, but it's been phased out. Even guys like McVay and Shanahan still is living with a lot of the outside zone stuff, but McVay especially has leaned heavily into gap scheme running and more physical running because defenses have gotten lighter. They've gotten better playing sideline to sideline for the outside zone stuff. They've adapted better for the play action off the outside zone stuff. there are ways to slow down that defense, and putting an umbrella on it with cover four stuff and speed and lighter bodies has been the solution for a lot of defenses across the NFL. And that's still what Arthur Smith is going to, even when his personnel doesn't fit that play style. That's why, McVay's gone to the heavier personnel gap scheme stuff more often. He wants bigger offensive linemen who can maul smaller linebackers who are built to go sideline to sideline. It's evolutionary in the NFL. What works one year will not work 5 years later. It's akin to Formula One. Everyone got into F1 watching the documentary on Netflix. And in that sport, they talk about how the best car in the first race of the season, because of all the alterations and the upgrades and the aerodynamics and the everything they learn throughout the season and how they alter these cars and their engines and everything throughout the year. The car that wins the first race of the year would likely finish dead last in the last race of the year if no alterations were made. That's like the NFL. These offenses change so drastically and so quickly. And while I've credited Arthur Smith for being a massive upgrade over Matt Canada, and he absolutely is. He's able to make some in-game adjustments. He's been able to, for a few weeks, revitalize Russell Wilson. But at its core, his offense is rather outdated. It worked really well with Derrick Henry, who's built in the lab to run that type of offense, to build up steam going to the outside and smash through linebackers. He gives you the stretch and the speed and the size element. Without him, Arthur Smith hasn't had a good counter. He wouldn't be the first guy in the history of the NFL to have one good idea and not be able to do anything else. He didn't revolutionize the sport of college football, maybe the way Chip Kelly did, but Chip Kelly came to the NFL with a plan, a spread attack, high tempo, a bunch of stuff that worked really well at Oregon and was solved pretty quickly. He had one good idea and he had to go back to college to find some new ones. And now he's built a new career at Ohio State as the offensive coordinator. He did fairly well at UCLA with limited resources. That's not the conversation, but there are other play callers in the history of this sport that have had one good idea, have not been able to evolve, and that might be where Arthur Smith is. They aren't equipped to run the outside zone stuff. And Najee Harris ran 10 zone runs to 2 gap runs. He's the ideal between the tackles gap scheme runner. That's what he's best at, being physical on those runs, getting downhill, not having to make a cutback decision. And yet, we're not just living with the outside zone stuff, we're living with the pitch stuff, which doesn't even give you the option of play action off of it, the bootleg stuff off of it, which is what Tannehill thrived with in Tennessee. And in some ways, that's to cater to Najee Harris's lack of vision. You get him the ball quicker, he can see the lane. But it's also never been blocked well because this offensive line for years was built to block gap scheme stuff. Now you're throwing pitch stuff. It takes time to make these adjustments. I understand that. But it also takes a smart coach who's able to recognize what the strengths of his current roster are. You can keep the eye in the sky, we're building towards this, as an organizational philosophy of like, these are the types of guys we want to draft and sign in free agency. But in a given year, especially your first year, you need to accept who's on your roster, play to their strengths. And Arthur Smith hasn't done a very good job of that. The philosophy of this year's offense and the Russell Wilson experiment once he took over for Justin Fields was to give him such a good and physical run game that he wouldn't fall back into bad habits, or if he did, it would be the effect of them would be limited because the game wasn't completely on his shoulders the way it was in Denver, the way it was in Seattle. Get back to the pre-Russ cooking era, right? The Russ as maybe a sous chef to Marshawn Lynch, or in this case, Najee Harris, Jaylen Warren. It didn't help that Warren had early season injuries, but the fact that Smith has never been able to put together a cohesive rushing attack aside from a couple games against the Raiders and the dregs of the NFL, is a disastrous failure. That's supposed to be his biggest strength. He's supposed to be the guy who runs out two tight ends, blocks with heavy personnel, and is able to run the ball above all else. He hasn't been able to do it. No, I don't think Najee Harris is an above average NFL running back. I think Jaylen Warren is better, but I think he has his limitations too. But I also think that the running back position in the NFL is its value is ticking back up, but it's been devalued for a reason because you can scheme yourself into not a great running game, but a serviceable one. Sure, there are injuries on the offensive line, but Omar Khan and Andy Weidel invested so heavily there that they've been able to largely put in serviceable players, right? Mason McCormick in his rookie season, and now he has a broken hand, as Mike Tomlin said in his press conference today. And I'm definitely going to get to some of Mike Tomlin's press conference comments. And, James Daniels went down with an injury. Almost everyone has missed time on that line. Troy Fautanu has been out. But it's not the worst offensive line talent in the NFL. It's enough that you should be able to run the ball, at least at a league average level. If you're a run-first offensive coordinator like Arthur Smith was billed as when he got hired in Pittsburgh. And then late in the game, after you haven't been running the ball well with Jaylen Warren or Najee Harris, he went to Cordell Patterson again. Not to relitigate every late possession in that game, because as the NFL moves, it already feels like ancient history on Saturday night. But to give big-time carries in the fourth quarter to Cordero Patterson when you could take the lead with a touchdown is baffling in the year 2025. Cordero Patterson has not been a good kick returner at all this year, which is the only utility of having him on the roster. And he hasn't been a good running back in 2 or 3 years. He's barely been a running back in his career. He is a kick returner. And Arthur Smith is in love with him. And this was the problem with him in Atlanta. He thought plays over players, right? I just got Michael Silver's book, The Why is Everything, about the Shanahan McVay guys, all of the guys that were on that Washington, then Redskins coaching staff in the teens under Mike Shanahan, who have proliferated all over the league and largely revolutionized it offensively. And one of the first things in that book that they talk about, and that those guys in those meeting rooms and everything, that brain trust that is now spread across the NFL as head coaches, they talked about players over plays. And while Arthur Smith shares a lot of core tenets with those guys offensively, with the outside zone stuff, the play action stuff, he does not share that philosophy. He thinks plays over players. And I think sometimes he thinks if you're deceiving the other team with the worst player on the field, they'll be surprised enough that that worst player gets the ball that you'll be more effective than if you just gave the ball to a better player. And I'm not sure. I don't mean to put a philosophy and put words into his mouth, but that's what it appears as from the outside. And that's just baffling that he hasn't learned his lesson. There are so many problems with this Steelers offense. A lack of talent is absolutely one of them. Arthur Smith has been an upgrade from Matt Canada. Anyone would have. Almost any actually qualified NFL play caller, I'll say literally any NFL qualified play caller, because Matt Canada was not qualified for the job he had, would have been an upgrade over Matt Canada. I've been an Arthur Smith defender this year. This last stretch has made it harder and harder to do. So if you want to blame Arthur Smith, go ahead, blame Arthur Smith. I could blame Russell Wilson for this. And considering my opinions on Russell Wilson heading into the year, I would like to. But I also saw it work with Russell Wilson. Maybe against worse defenses, but better than I ever expected it could have. I defended Arthur Smith throughout the year. But maybe that has to stop. Both of those guys are culpable for the offensive collapse, for the 4-game losing streak that has the Steelers limping into a playoff matchup in Baltimore that just looks and feels like it's going to be a bloodbath on Saturday night. But the real answer for what went wrong with this Steelers season and why the Steelers are where they are, especially offensively, is probably Mike Tomlin. And this has been a growing sentiment across Steelers media and eventually somewhat the NFL media. Can it ever be Mike Tomlin's fault? Because a lot of us are ready to start blaming him at least a little bit. Mike Tomlin is a good coach. Mike Tomlin would be hired in a second. That's what you always hear. If the Steelers fired Mike Tomlin, he'd be hired in a second. Okay. That's not justification for keeping him as your head coach. Sometimes things go stale. Sometimes things run their course. You need fresh ideas. Theo Epstein, I have maybe a more relevant example after this, but this jumps into my head because it's something he has talked about in plenty of different forums. Theo Epstein, who broke the curse of the Bambino with the Red Sox and then ended the Cubs' 100-year World Series drought, has said anything after 10 years, and I think even put the marker maybe a little bit shorter than that, in one place, it goes stale. That's incredible self-awareness from somebody who could still be running the Chicago Cubs if he wanted to, and now is running a lot of things with Major League Baseball. But it's also probably true. That's a long time to be in a high-stress environment and a place that it's an environment and a sport and entity, whatever, that evolves really quickly. That's what sports do. They evolve really quickly. And you're just so liable to be stuck in your old ways because you don't have a chance to step outside of yourself and reflect on what direction are we heading? What mistakes am I making? Mike Tomlin is a great head coach. I believe he could win a Super Bowl somewhere else. I do not believe he can ever win another Super Bowl with the Pittsburgh Steelers. I have come to that conclusion, and it may be ridiculous to come to that conclusion in a season that I picked the Steelers to finish with 10 wins, that they finished with 10 wins, and they clinched the playoffs much earlier than I would have expected. And in a season with Russell Wilson and Justin Fields as your quarterbacks. But because of the nature of that loss to Cincinnati and the things that he continues to espouse about his philosophy for football, it's not a philosophy that can get the Steelers out of this purgatory because he doesn't even recognize that they're in one. He's not able to recognize the problem. And maybe that's an ownership problem. We can't fire the owner. You can't fire the whole team. Eventually, you might have to fire the head coach. Tomlin opened his press conference today talking about, in his long opening statement, he talked about the lessons learned of this 4-game losing streak. And, unfortunately, you learn more lessons when you're losing than you're winning. And the first lesson he said that they learned, quote, "We suffered the consequences of not winning the turnover battle in recent weeks, and that's been very evident," end quote. First, the Steelers won the turnover battle against the Bengals and failed to turn a fourth quarter muffed punt into a touchdown and an end of first half interception into any points. Either one would have won them the game. 3 points off of two bad turnovers on the Bengals side of the field from Burrow and from, I mean, it wasn't really Burrow's fault. It was tipped. It was a great play by Meanie Bishop to come up with the interception, but from Burrow and from the punt returner. Second, I'm exhausted of turnover talk. Turnovers in football are inherently fluky. In many ways, they're a thing that happens and not so much a thing you can control, right? And the ways that you, and that's because it's an oblong football on a field with 22 players flying around, the most athletic people in the world, and it's going to bounce weird ways sometimes. Sometimes it's going to bounce to you, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it bounces to you for 4 games straight, sometimes it doesn't. So even if we are willing to take the suffered the consequences of not winning the turnover battle, oh, the football gods looked down on us poorly and we lost 4 games in a row to good teams, even if we're going to take that, controlling the turnover battle should not be the thing you're focusing on controlling in modern football. Because the ways that you can control turnovers are by being overly conservative offensively, not throwing the ball over the middle of the field, all these things that have been conversations since the very first game of the season when Justin Fields attempted no passes over the middle of the field against the Falcons. And a bunch of people said it was a giant problem because that's where you can make so much hay in the NFL. And a bunch of other people said, you won the game. Why does it matter? Stay away from Jesse Bates, like Jesse Bates is Ed Reed. It was a problem. It's a philosophical problem with this team that they play so scared of turning the ball over that they can never actually succeed on offense. A few turnovers can be fine. It means you're being aggressive. The way you control them on offense is by being overly conservative. If you take fewer risks, you'll have fewer turnovers. That doesn't necessarily mean you'll be better, but you'll have fewer turnovers. And if all you're trying to do is win the turnover battle, mission accomplished. On the defensive side, you control them by being defensively aggressive, blitzing more, trying to cause more havoc, taking more chances in the secondary. And that can leave you liable to give up big plays, which the Steelers have done in both the run game and the pass game this season with the most expensive defense in the NFL. Steelers have always done a good job forcing turnovers. That doesn't mean they've always been the best defense in the NFL, and they're far from it this season. You can't only focus on, I talked about this last time, did a podcast, focusing so heavily on the turnover battle. Yes, it is important. You need to protect the football. The team that wins the turnover battle wins more often than not in the NFL. That is absolutely true. But there are still ways to counteract that, ways that you can control much more easily. Constructing your entire coaching philosophy around turnovers may have worked in the past. In a more physical age of football where everyone was scared to throw over the middle of the field because of the risk of injury, because guys like Troy Polamalu and Ryan Clark were back there with big hits, and everyone was blitzing more aggressively on defense, right? The Dick LeBeau defense was so effective because of its own blitzes. There were less good and less mobile quarterbacks. The best quarterbacks in the NFL were Tom Brady and Peyton Manning. If you could get pressure on them, yes, they could dissect you really quickly because they were geniuses, and this is not to take away from them. But now, not only can Lamar Jackson and Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen, even Joe Burrow, do that to you if you blitz, even if you get pressure, they can still evade it and turn it into positive plays. It's so much more difficult to try to win football games without an elite quarterback, which maybe is not the fault of Mike Tomlin that he doesn't have one, but without trying to play aggressively anyways. I mean, we just watched a game last night for the number 1 seed in the NFC between Jared Goff and Sam Darnold. Both guys have been playing incredibly well with aggressive, innovative offensive play callers. Sam Darnold was considered a complete bust as the number 2 or 3 overall pick of the Jets. I think 3 because Saquon Barkley went 2 that year. And with Kevin O'Connell and this team that was supposed to win 5 games, the Minnesota Vikings this year, he has one of the best passer ratings on throws over 20 yards downfield and completion percentage over expectation on those throws. Partially that's because of great receivers, but it's also because a coaching staff that trusts their quarterback, even when all the evidence says maybe you shouldn't. And it's gotten the best out of him. That's how you get the best out of a quarterback in the NFL. Tua Tagovailoa is a very flawed quarterback. He is not a quarterback I think can win a Super Bowl, not one I'd want on my team. Mike McDaniel has been very successful with him because he plays to his strengths. He plays highly aggressively. Brian Flores was never going to get that out of him because he had a defensive mindset, much like Tomlin. Protect the ball. You don't make mistakes. That's what's happening to Caleb Williams in Chicago right now. He's so scared to turn the ball over. He's not making plays. And yes, that can lead to you not turning the ball over. But it also limits your offense in an NFL that's so high powered with so many elite quarterbacks where you have to keep up. And the Steelers and Mike Tomlin organizationally have no interest in running that race. They want to drag you into the mud and try to win a rock fight. And yes, that leads to 10-win seasons, even with Kenny Pickett, Mitchell Trubisky, Mason Rudolph, even hell, Duck Hodges. We've heard this so often. But even if the Steelers had an elite quarterback, I just don't know what Mike Tomlin would be willing to do with it. And maybe even more importantly than that, I don't trust Tomlin to develop, identify that guy. Part of the lack of success this offense has this year and over the past couple of years are not just that there is an elite quarterback play. It's that they've made terrible hires at offensive coordinator. Randy Fichtner was hired because Ben liked him. There was no other reason than that. And the proof that there was no other reason than that, Randy Fichtner, you haven't heard of him since. Matt Canada after that would not have been hired. I do not, this is not reported. I can almost guarantee with the exact same resume that Matt Canada had, if he had it at, let's pick a random ACC school, North Carolina, if he was the exact same play caller with the exact same resume, exact same stats at North Carolina, not in the facility, the Rooney facility on the south side at Pitt, can almost guarantee you he would not have become the Steelers offensive coordinator. There was nothing in his past that showed that he deserved that opportunity. And he held the job into his 3rd year. It's malpractice from the top down. And yes, we can chant Fire Canada at Steelers games and Penguins games and everywhere. And we can boo Kenny Pickett when he comes back from Pitt. Kenny Pickett was never, for events at Pitt, Kenny Pickett was never going to be an NFL quarterback. He shouldn't have been drafted in the 1st round. Matt Canada should have never been an offensive play caller. You know who identified both guys and believed in them to do those jobs? Mike Tomlin. Eventually, even if you think he's a good coach, even if you think he'd be hired in 2 seconds, you have to move on. You eventually just have to move on. And if you think that Tomlin would get hired in 2 seconds if he got fired, then that means you can probably trade him. Coach trades don't happen a lot in the NFL, but they do happen. This is the time of year they're talked about. If the Steelers, as I expect, bow out disgracefully against Baltimore in the wild card round and do not have a playoff win since 2016, if that streak remains, even in a year that I had low expectations for, I come away massively disappointed by Mike Tomlin. And at the exact same point I was after last season when I was ready to move on from. I think this roster has a lot of talent. I think he does very little to maximize it, right? Like the Steelers have struggled mightily in the draft. At the end of the Colbert era, that was the case. Omar Khan, we like to think he's doing better. Roman Wilson hasn't seen the field, right? That's injuries. Falatanu hasn't seen the field. We don't really know. We like Herbig. We like Benton. We like Joey Porter Jr. Patrick Jones has been a roller coaster. Like, we don't know that this is a problem that's fixed, but it was a big problem when Tomlin was very involved at the end of the Colbert era. He shoulders some of that blame. He's also a big reason philosophically they've spent so much on the defensive side of the ball. And with all those resources, the most expensive defense in the NFL by far, his unit has to be better than it is. The most expensive defense in the league under a defensive-minded head coach can't be just good. That's unacceptable, which is what the Steelers are. They're 14th in yards per play, and there are so many better metrics, DVOA, EPA. They're good, not great in all of them. Arthur Smith was mentioned for the Jets job today, and he might be getting an interview inexplicably. Although it's the Jets job, so I guess that's how you explain it. I would have no confidence in Tomlin's next hire if Arthur Smith somehow gets it, or if the Steelers decide to move on from Arthur Smith, or if Arthur Smith wants to take some other job. And I just gave you a whole argument about why this offensive collapse might even be Arthur Smith's fault. And I'd be worried about how bad of a downgrade they'd hire if he left. I'd have even less confidence in Tomlin and whoever that OC is or Smith developing a young quarterback, which is the way you get out of this purgatory is with an elite quarterback. And the only way to get one is to draft one. And you could look to free agency, right? Sam Darnold's going to be a free agent. I would have zero faith that if the Steelers if the Steelers signed Sam Darnold in free agency this offseason, he would have a season that remotely resembles what he's doing in Minnesota with Kevin O'Connell, who I think is one of the best head coaches in the NFL. Then there's the George Pickens of it all. Because we're staying on this Mike Tomlin thing. I've been going for 15 minutes strong. I feel like I've given a good 15 minutes to Wilson, a good 15 minutes to Smith. And Tomlin's probably going to get a little more than that. I think that's what he deserves if we're doing a division of the blame. There's the George Pickens of it all. Tomlin gets so much credit for managing personalities like Antonio Brown, Le'Veon Bell, now George Pickens. But his hubris and his belief that he can control these volatile players has led to nightmare situations like this one, where all of the team's pass-catching eggs are in the George Pickens basket after Deontay Johnson quit on the team last season. And now Deontay Johnson has quit on other teams, so again, the credit goes to Tomlin. He's the only one who got him to play. But you could have gotten another wide receiver that wouldn't have been that tumultuous. And now it looks like you're in a situation where it feels untenable to bring George Pickens back next year, and he's your only NFL quality wide receiver. Calvin Austin is fine. I like Calvin Austin. I think he's a good player. But George Pickens is your only needle mover on offense at wide receiver. And it feels untenable to bring him back. I wanted them to move on from him after the Dallas game when he was loafing around the field. I'm just so tired of these diva wide receivers that the Steelers get and then get credit for getting the best out of. Can't we just get a non-diva wide receiver and get the best out of him? I get you get a discount on these guys in the second and third round because George Pickens would have been a first round talent, but the injury also was a reason that there was a discount, not just the behavior. And there are other good second round wide receivers, Lad McConkey this year, that aren't nightmares to deal with. It was the worst game, this game against Cincinnati, the worst game of Pickens' season, probably of his career. 1 catch, 0 yards on 6 targets with 2 drops. Didn't come down with the potential game winner on the final drive after another miscommunication with Wilson, where Wilson threw it maybe a little too deep, but I also feel like it was more that Wilson threw it further to the sideline and Pickens broke it further inside. He needed to get out of bounds if he caught that ball. They had used their final timeout. Would have been a tough catch. It could have been a better throw, but I tend to side slightly more with Russell Wilson on that one. Pickens should have been breaking more towards the sideline. But one of the arguments for Wilson replacing Justin Fields was that he had a great relationship with George Pickens. He revitalized George Pickens. Now they're not on the same page. Tomlin lets these issues fester, and he's better at dealing with them than most, but he's not good enough to prevent them from eventually blowing up. Pickens is a ticking time bomb. And I want him, and probably more importantly, I want Mike Tomlin gone this offseason. I'm ready for a reset. I've said I want the Steelers to pick a direction. And a few weeks ago, it looked like that direction could be up. It could be bring Russell Wilson back. It could be trade for a wide receiver and just try to maximize this aging core. But more and more, that just feels like it's unrealistic. I'd accept it if they go all in for one more year. If they bring Mike Tomlin back, you have to make aggressive moves in the offseason to acquire veteran players to try to claw your way out of this purgatory. If not, let's try to not strip this thing down completely for parts. I don't think that's ever the best thing to do in the NFL, but let's move some older players, try to get more draft picks, try to retool this thing fairly quickly. Teams like the Vikings have done it. Like, you need a quarterback, but there's still a lot of talent here. I just don't think that Mike Tomlin is going to be the guy that ever gets the most out of it on offense or on defense. That's why, to me, he's the number one person to blame for this collapse. Now, finally, we have a playoff game to talk about. I'm talking like the season's over. I feel like the season's over. It's hard not to feel like the season's over, but there is still officially one more game left for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Maybe more, because the Steelers in the past have had Lamar Jackson's number until they didn't, until they finally played him healthy with a much better offensive coordinator and a cast of characters around him. And he played the best game he's played against the Steelers in his career the last time he met them. The Steelers open as 10-point underdogs on the road in Baltimore on Saturday night. It is the Saturday night game, not the Sunday night game, which doesn't really matter, but I thought that was interesting that the assumption would be NBC has the first pick over Amazon Prime, which is what the Steelers will be playing on Saturday night. So you would imagine if they wanted Steelers Ravens, they could have had it. Instead, they have Buccaneers Commanders, which DC is a very big market. They're very excited about Jaden Daniels. I was just down in DC for Christmas time, near DC, Northern Virginia area. And for the first time ever, been going down there for years, went to school down there. First time ever, tons of Commanders jerseys, Terry McLaurin jerseys, Jaden Daniels jerseys. That was really cool to see. And I understand why NBC would go with that, but Steelers Ravens draws. And they're the Saturday night game, which I just found interesting. The Ravens defense has been one of the best in the league since moving Kyle Hamilton from safety to nickel. And the Steelers got firsthand experience of that on fourth down in Baltimore with a chance to pull themselves out of a deficit when Wilson took a deep shot to Calvin Austin and Kyle Hamilton was the one back deep who broke it up. Marlon Humphrey has had a resurgent season after being banged up last year. We know the cast of characters on that defense. Roquan Smith, one of the best linebackers in the NFL. They've gotten a very good pass rush out of, a mixed bag, which is maximizing your talent. The Ravens are doing a much better job maximizing their more limited talent on the defensive side than the Steelers are with their most expensive defense in the NFL. Lamar is having his best season, coming off his best game against the Steelers. He's a 2-time MVP. He may not win it this year because Josh Allen's been that good, but this is his best season. And that's the team the Steelers have to go on the road to play. Yes, they've had his number in the past. Yes, they do a really good job against scrambling quarterbacks, and that is a credit to Mike Tomlin. They have really good rush lane discipline against these types of players, and it is effective. I believe that the Steelers can make this game a bit sweatier than the Ravens would like it. I'm sure the Ravens were not thrilled to see they have to play the Steelers and not the Chargers. But I don't think they're really that worried about this Pittsburgh team the way it's looked over the last month plus. The Steelers could have been playing the 10-7 Texans in Houston, but instead are heading into a potential bloodbath in Baltimore, and they really only have themselves to blame. They held Joe Burrow, having a historically great season, to 19 points and could only manage 17 against the worst defense in the NFL, arguably the worst defense in the NFL, probably the worst defense in the NFL. A defense that got Lou Anarumo, who was well known for holding Patrick Mahomes in check in the AFC Championship game and getting the Bengals to the Super Bowl, fired today. That's how bad that Bengals defense that just shut down Russell Wilson and Arthur Smith was. So that gets into my level of confidence for the Steelers offense against the Ravens. It's not high. I don't know that it could be. I don't know how it could be. I have faith that with a healthy defensive line, that's been a very good defensive line, the Steelers will be able to impact Lamar Jackson more than most teams will. But there's nothing about this matchup that makes me feel good that the Steelers can actually win it. You may find more optimistic Steelers fans than I, and I tried down the stretch of this season to be more optimistic. I tried to give the Steelers some slack when they lost to Philadelphia, tried to be understanding when they lost to the Chiefs, but eventually that runs out. And I think the Steelers season will expire as well on Saturday night in Baltimore. For more of a preview of that game and maybe a more optimistic perspective, tune in on Wednesday to Tommy Jagai and Shane Kubis's show, the Still Curtain podcast on YouTube, Spotify. Make sure to subscribe, especially on YouTube. We really, really appreciate your support wherever you're listening. Please subscribe, and a big thank you to everyone who helps produce this fine show and get it out on all of those wonderful podcasting networks where you can listen to it. And a thank you to listening. I'll be back talking to you next week with an instant reaction show. I know the schedule got a little screwy with the holidays and then me going to the game on Saturday night, but we'll be back with an instant reaction show after Steelers Ravens next week. And until then, have a great week and go Steelers.